Remember, we don't actually decide. There's one place that's decide, and in India, I'm just giving you this, and this is true in all of those countries. The deciders, the important parts, the tax rules that you will see are the tax rules that these people agree. And so when we talk about rulemaking is a domestic matter that is done by the domestic parliament for the people that they represent. And we need to have this in mind when we think about the international tax architecture and all of those things, that the power sits with the people represented in their parliaments. We can propose, we can have ideas, and we've done this for many, many years. There's a UN model convention, for instance, in the treaty space, and then there's an OECD, and they're different. And some countries, in fact, pick and choose. We also have countries that are somewhat hybrid. They do a treaty with one country, they use the OECD model, they do a treaty with another country, they use the UN model. The world is a complicated place, and that's the reality.
The intergovernmental side, the UN Tax Convention. Now, we're one step away from the final affirmation that the convention will be in negotiations next year. We expect that to happen. The second committee of the General Assembly on the 27th.
Governments have already taken on obligations under international human rights law, which have an a consequence for taxes, and it's simply a matter of understanding what those consequences and obligations are and implementing them. It worries me that the OECD, because of its history, does not have a specific human rights mandate. The UN very clearly does. It's one of the principles behind the UN. It worries me that not enough tax officials, particularly officials involved in international discussions, understand what those obligations are, that there's an educational role there as well as an implementation role. So I don't think it's a matter of debate, it's simply a matter of recognizing the obligations that governments have already.
But one thing that we must always see, that whether it is the OECD or it is the UN, whenever this work is being done of developing newer tax rules, they are always accompanied by rules that relate to dispute resolution, dispute management, or even dispute avoidance. So it's always a package. It's not as if these rules are simply designed to, get more tax. It does automatically take into account this point, that there should be consistency and that there should be fewer and fewer disputes arising at all. Now, in fact, I think you also referred to the point that Achim made, that eventually it's not about the rules that the OECD makes or the UN makes. It's eventually what individual governments begin to implement through their domestic laws or by signing up to these multilateral arrangements. And I think every government now is alive to this. Even a budget has pre-budget consultations with industry and all the interested groups. So I think we can be pretty sure that going forward, these concerns will be taken on board. And I remember saying this at another panel, that it's not the instruments that are at the disposal of governments. That was a discussion about so many of these anti-avoidance rules that are available. It's not about the number of tools that are available in our toolbox, it is how we apply them.
Touch upon Article XX when we were talking about space taxation and the rendering of services in the space. Okay, that article could apply. What's this article about for the interest of everybody? It's a work stream we undertook at the UN Tax Committee in order to address the tax challenges of globalization and digitalization, not in the same manner than Pillar 1 has intended, not in the same manner with my friend Rashad we have done with Article 12b, but in order to take into account the new business models, the lack of need for physical presence in order to engage into business in a market. So the same idea was there. So how to adapt the United Nations model in a way where the proxy for nexus was no longer reliable. So physical presence is the proxy for nexus throughout the entire United Nations model. the same for the OECD model, but we are now circumscribing the discussion into the United Nations model, which is the one where the UN Tax Committee was mandated to update from time to time. So when we brainstorm on how to adapt the model and get rid of that hard threshold, which is no longer relevant for many business models, one of the ideas that the committee in its majority considered was, why don't we take into account a new rule that escapes from the scope of Article 7, which is business profits. So let's make a rule specific for the tax treatment of services. And that rule will not include any physical present type of test. There will be no threshold.
So if you look at stakeholder consultation at the first limb, you would look at OECD, UN consulting with each other and creating a tax policy. Limb 2, when the governments are going to negotiate or provide their perspectives into OECD, into UN, they would want to take inputs from taxpayers. The third limb is the point at time where the government is actually going to frame the law, and again you need the taxpayer inputs at that point of time. Going back to the point of Indra, that how is a taxpayer being...
So ICC is the business representative of 45 million companies from all industries, so it's another Tolia type of organization. All sizes and also our regulations. We are representing about the technology and the nationalities, one is in India, in about 90 countries. In the type of engagement that we do in taxation, we do engage, and we do that constructively with both the OECD and the UN. And in regards to the UN, ICC as a supermarket service office, so we are sole official business representative.
One thing that is recognized always is that tax is a sovereign function, so it's up to the governments to do whatever they want to, and these are only recommendations. So as such, there cannot be said to be much of a conflict in the roles of the two bodies, and they have a full space to coexist, and they have been working on different areas where there is no overlap. Overlaps is mostly in the area of this model tax convention for avoidance of double taxation. And there the differences, because UN convention is supposed to be for more source oriented, whereas the OECD convention, as compared to the OECD convention.
We look forward to more and more harmonious relationship between the OECD and the UN, because ultimately what we desire is, the risk what we foresee is the risk of fragmentation in the international policy. This is best avoided for the businesses because this creates a lot of uncertainty. Certainly there is a great cost of administration which the businesses have to undergo. Couple that with more uncertainty, it really builds on to the entire process. So while I understand there are a lot of measures being taken at the highest level, and looking at the entirety of the situation, that we are a part of this larger design, but the expectation and what I see from the two coming together is what we'll really benefit with, because there'll be less of uncertainty around this, the cost complexities. There's also a perception about our data being shared, the kind of risk which we fear of sharing of data at this larger level. So something around that also should be kept in mind while devising so many kind of framework and policy, the procedures around it. The UN and the OECD both have model tax laws. But along with that, if there are model tax procedures and rules, which kind of will be a guiding star to the guiding pole to the nations, to have kind of uniformity around this, somewhere to think how these are actually executed at the lower level. There's one thing devising laws, but how they are actually taken up to the last level, some kind of hand-holding on the monitoring process there. So I think to that extent, we look up to these stalwarts and the minds there at the at these people that you should think something from the practical angle of it, how it is going to implement and how it is going to touch the basic common businesses. And across the globe, the cost really comes up enormously. Talking about pillar 1, pillar 2, this is really going to be an added on task with us. We're talking about redevising the articles, but the risk of understanding the interpretations around all this is what we fear, but we are happy to be part of it and pay our fair share of taxes, but in a simplistic and more clear manner.
The survey that Thomson Reuters had done last year, it did a survey of 21 multinational enterprises, and believe it or not, the cost of tax compliance for these entities was $500 million, and almost 45% of this was just foreign tax compliance cost and tracking the regulatory space. There was another survey done by the Tax Justice Network, and there it turned out that almost all of these survey respondents felt that their cost of tracking regulatory updates and complying with all of these updates will increase, but the resources that will be at their disposal will continue to be limited. There was another question in that survey where there were only 25% of respondents who said that they have not let go of a profitable business opportunity because of regulatory and compliance concern. And to me, that is a very big cause of concern, that if only 25%, which really means that 75% people believe that they have let go of a profitable business opportunity due to regulatory and compliance concerns. And so here I feel that, there is space for the OECD and the UN to come together, work together, ease all of this uncertainty for businesses. And, like Indra was saying, where does a taxpayer go with this level of uncertainty and different compliance regulatory?